So I did my PhD as part of a project looking at domestication in the Arctic through Aberdeen University, and it was called the Arctic Domus Project. And its remit really was to rethink ideas about domestication and what that means through different areas of research in the Arctic. And mine was with Shetland native breeds, and particularly Shetland ponies. And today, really, I'm going to give just a bit of an overview about domestication generally, and speak a bit about the Shetland context, and then reflect a little about how these relationships can be part of well-being, healthy landscapes, and sustainability. So domestication is something we often think of or describe as a point in history where humans started to exert significant control over the land and animals around them. And it's often thought of as almost like we took a step out of nature, becoming beings of culture. And this was often, and still can be, used as a clumsy racist shorthand for ideas of human civilization and progress, with more industrialized forms of domestication being higher and hunter-gatherer relationships being seen as somehow lower. And these sort of stories about domestication, whether they're celebrating it as one of humanity's main achievements, or sometimes, as we see more commonly today, looking at it as the point where everything started to go wrong, where relationships with land and animals broke down, where a lot of our environmental problems come from that we're experiencing today. Either way, whether it's positive or negative, these stories often take for granted that domestication is about domination. It is about control over animals. And as we know, stories can have a significant effect on how we live in the world, how we see the world, and can shape what types of relationships are possible. And this is why I like to tell a different story about domestication, and one that's based on the idea of domus as home. So creating a home with animals. Pedigree breeding practices are often seen as the epitome of this sort of domestication as domination. You know, you're looking at careful planned breeding with a particular outcome in mind. And we're so used to a lot of this. You know, we have particular breeds of horse or dog, and you know, we're quite used to referring to them and expecting those sort of characteristics. But that's actually more of a recent part of domestication. For a lot of history, the differences between members of the same species of domestic animal tended to be because they were in different climates or doing different types of work, rather than something that was planned and predicted. And where that started to change was with Robert Bakewell, who he's kind of credited as starting pedigree breeding by taking a sort of lanky native breed of sheep, doing a lot of breeding and turning it into something that produced a lot more meat. And despite the fact that creating and maintaining breeds has a lot of unintended and unexpected consequences, the resulting animals were often described as coming about because of the skill of the design of the breeder. The animals themselves were often described as passive in the process, like they were clay to be molded rather than sentient beings. And this type of pedigree breeding practice was often used to reinforce narratives about not just human control over animals and their right to do that, but particularly about the aristocracy's ability to control the land and animals around them, because so many of these early experiments in breeding were done by the landowners, certainly within the British context. But the stories of Shetland domestication and Shetland breeds are very different. I mean, up here we are at a latitude of 60 degrees north. We are a group of islands. It's about 100 islands. And we get really wild weather. I don't even know, you might even be able to hear some of it. It's like rain and gales outside just now. But regularly we'll have gale force winds throughout the winter months. And because no force more than 3 miles from the sea, the type of gales we have are salt laden. Whatever direction the wind is coming from, it is carrying the sea with it and scouring the winter landscapes. And this obviously made agriculture very difficult. We've only got about 100 growing days at this latitude and only a few areas of fertile ground. So we've got some good fertile growing ground in the sort of limestone valleys, but a lot of our landscape is quite rugged, exposed hill. And as if this wasn't enough, the lairds or landowners had an exploitative system of debt bondage. So the crofter would get the croft and the land that they would rent from this landlord. But they had to buy all their things from their landlord, and they had to sell what they produced to the landlord, who decided the prices. So, you know, not really very, very fair. If they were to complain about it, they would have been just thrown off their land and have no way of making an income. And this is the context in which the Shetland breeds are really understood today, because so the croft would have, like I say, the good growing ground, which is where you'd have a few crops and keep your cow, because the Shetland cow is a little bit fancier than the other Shetland breeds. You know, they like good food, they like a little bit of shelter in bad weather. So they would have this small area, but the rest of the croft is this big expanse of hill ground, usually shared with other crofters. And at first glance, you know, this is land you can do nothing with. You can't plant, you can't graze most types of lands, livestock, but it is a natural home for the Shetland ponies and Shetland sheep. And these breeds were so hardy they could live out all year round in this type of landscape. Their thick coats providing warmth, small size allowing them to find shelter. And so they were able to just live out, costing very little to keep. And if they had been expensive to keep, most crofters wouldn't have been able to have them. It would have just been out with what was possible. And all the time that they were costing so little to keep, they were providing important resources. The sheep, of course, being used for meat and for their fleeces being turned into the famous Shetland knitwear. But also the Shetland ponies, it can be strange to think about it today. We think of Shetland ponies as small and maybe cute, but they were actually a really important working animal. And they carried people and goods across the countryside. And until there was an integrated road network about 150 years ago, were the main source of land transport. And when I first started my research, and I've been looking up Shetland, and I mean, some of you might have seen some of the Uphellia Fire Festival footage that's been circulating recently. You know, there's a very strong Viking imagery. You know, there's our Norse history is part of this culture. And I'd thought that this would affect how people thought about the horses. I thought they might be Viking horses like we see with the Icelandic horses. But over and over, it was this crofting history that people were telling me about. And these stories weren't stories of domination. They weren't trying to dominate the animals for their profit. It was more stories about collaboration and companionship, that people and animals survived and thrived together. And in a direct contrast to them being used by the aristocracy for control over populations, within the Shetland context, it was a lot more that people and animals were resisting the control. This was a way that they could make a good life despite exploitation. And so this, obviously a lot has changed since the history of where crofting was the main economic activity. And this can raise questions about nostalgia. You know, there's been a lot written about how our representations of the past can gloss over some of the more difficult truths. It can romanticize things and essentially have people longing for a past or a way of life that never actually existed. And I've got a quote here, this is certainly nostalgia, something that comes in a lot in academic writing about Shetland. And here I'm quoting Jonathan Church from his article, Confabulations of Community. And he says, people are so frequently pointing out their differences, and there seems to be such a self-conscious regard of being Shetland on Shetland. Yet this cultural self-consciousness, which is always locating particular tokens, tags, and representations, and suggesting somehow the essence of community, of belonging or identity, is not only contained in them, but springs from them. And there's an odd disjointed feature. The difficulty is these tokens, tags, and representations that construct community. Then these tokens point out those who are seemingly genuine community members, and other members of the community have become displaced, seeming to be a lesser reality than the representations that now locate them. And that sort of theme comes through quite a few of the academic literature on Shetland, this sort of idea of certain stories as very prominent in the national, the local identity, and that the other stories that tell things in a different way are maybe not so accepted. And it is certainly true that there are elements of nostalgia and there are parts of the history that are considered more important than others. But it is a little bit more nuanced than just a sort of nostalgic false remembering. Because crofting is still a valued way of life for many, and the ideas associated with crofting history have a direct relevance on how people are living with their animals today and how they choose to maintain these relationships. So the stories are part of an unfolding, everyday relationship of domestication. And one of the ways that it becomes very important is in trying to avoid over-domestication. And I'm quoting again here, but this is one of the Shetland pony breeders that I worked with. And she said that because of domestication, the way that a lot of them are kept, you can't tell whether they're stupid or intelligent because they don't have the opportunity to show you. Things like the weather and predicting the weather and being able to find your own shelter and that sort of thing. If you're standing in a small paddock with a post and rail fence and a stable, you don't need to have those instincts and they will leave you. And then if you have foals, they don't have that to pass on to them. And this sentiment was echoed by a lot of the pony breeders in Shetland. And interestingly, a lot of Arctic Domestic colleagues found similar ideas across Northern domestication. This way of trying to not accidentally take away something, not take away the independence through their domestication relationships. And things like giving rugs, stables, taking away their choices, not listening to ponies' opinions, deciding for them, rendering them passive in relationships. All of this was thought over a few generations to potentially take away the skills that ponies have developed over centuries. And there's several different ways that people would try and keep these skills. But the one I'm focusing on today is landscape. And I'm going to use the example of the island of Fulla to describe how that works. So although this is Fulla, this type of relationship was what I was finding throughout my fieldwork. Fulla is an island about 20 miles to the west of Shetland. It has about 30 residents, and a lot of their horses live out in the hill. And when I was meeting the first pony breeder there, I was quite surprised how few horses were around her croft. There was, a beautiful stallion in a field of summer flowers, and a mare and a foal grazing. And she basically said to me that all her horses, they're out there, and indicated towards the hill. And then introduced me to the mare and foal, saying that this grey mare is a wonderful mother. She's one of the best, but she's getting older and she thinks that maybe this will be her last foal before she joins the pensioners in the hill. And intrigued, I'm asking, who's the pensioners? And she says that the older mares, even from different herds, will often start to group together. And in the past, this was a way of avoiding the stallion. You know, they didn't want to get in foal, they were going nowhere near him. And today, even though there isn't a stallion in the hill, these older mares will still spend time together. And it's through watching their horses, seeing what they're doing, their roles in the herd, that people really get to know their animals as individuals, but also get to know the Shetland pony breed. It's not just how they relate to watching the horses doesn't just tell them about the horses, it shapes other types of domestication relationships. So, for example, if they see their horses dashing about the hill during the summer, kicking up their feet, they usually know that means it's a day of midges, like a small biting insect, and they're bothering the horses. Now, those midges also bother the sheep, and that makes it a good day to bring the sheep down to the croft. You know, they'll need to bring the sheep in a couple of times a year for routine care and maintenance. And if they can see that it's a midgy day, then the sheep are much more likely to want to come down to the croft because it gets them closer to the sea, they've got a breeze, it disperses the insects that are bothering them. So it's a way of sort of interpreting the horse's behaviour, understanding the sheep's behaviour, and bringing that all together so that the sheep are coming willingly rather than you're like trying to drag them down when they're not wanting to. And the same way you get to know where horses like to go in different weather. So if you see them in a particular place, you might know that that means that a gale's coming from the east and you'd start to prepare yourself for that weather. And if you're looking for a particular horse and you know who their friends are and you see their best friend over there, that's a good place to start looking. The pregnant mares will usually come down from the hill to give birth close to the croft. And at one point I asked, what if they don't come down, do you go out looking for them? And they said if that ever happened, that's what they would do, but it's never been the case. The horses know it's time and they just come down to the croft and their owners just trust that they will do that. On paper, this can sound like quite a hands-off type of domestication relationship. You might just see the horses in the hill and think, well, that's easy. But there's a lot of care and attention to it, and particularly in the horse's early years. And it's the same with the sheep. So like lambs and foals will spend a lot of time close to the croft being handled. And through that, they learn that the croft is a place of care and safety. They learn to trust the humans in their lives. And once they're out in the hill, it's not just a case that, oh, that's them in the hill now. Even if people aren't specifically going to look for their horses, they're still paying attention. And it's not just the pony breeders. You'll often hear conversations between people being like, oh, I saw that horse over there, they're looking happy, or, oh, that one was looking a bit cold, or, just updating each other on these, the behaviours of the horses. And I'd already been looking at domestication as being a relationship between people and ponies in Shetland, where the ponies were active participants. But it was in Fulla that I came to understand the landscape as a participant. It's this type of land that the breed evolved in, living in this rough hill. And so much that we love and recognise about Shetland ponies comes from that. Their small size, their thick woolly coat, their mane and tail, all of that was from this type of environment. And giving horses time in the hill is a way of keeping these features and characteristics. And that isn't just trying to recreate the past. Shetland ponies are like this, so we'll keep them like this. A lot of the skills from the hill are very relevant today. If, their hardiness means they cost less money. You don't need stables, you don't need blankets, they don't need a lot of fancy food. And that's important for the Shetland breeders, but it also makes the breed popular for other folks, because if you've got a fancy racehorse, it's costing a lot of money and it's lonely, you could get another horse the same, or you could get a Shetland pony buddy that's, it's not going to eat you out of house and home. The high stepping action that they developed going over the hill ground, stepping over rocks and difficult terrain, is a good thing for the show ponies, which is something they do a lot of today. And that same type of sure-footedness and intelligence makes them fantastic as a child's riding horse, which again is a role that they do a lot. And perhaps most importantly is the adaptability, because as people would often say, you know, we don't know what's coming, things are changing. These horses need to be able to change. So to keep them relevant in terms of economics, also to keep them able to live in the sort of landscapes in Shetland's future. And Time in the Hill was also a way of achieving a balance between working with horses and having intense human contact, and a way of letting the horses have time to themselves. Folk would often say if you worked a horse too much, if you were to be always telling them what to do, they go on autopilot and stop thinking for themselves, they stop communicating. And so giving them time in the hill was giving them their own time and space and avoiding that. And I write about the hill as being a storied place, using Tom Van Doren's from Flightways, where he describes storied places as a type of embodied intersubjective placemaking. And the Shetland Hill becomes an important storied place, with each new generation, human and equine, learning from each other, but also others who inhabit and have inhabited this landscape, with folk interpreting and responding to changing weather and season in relation to their horses. And this sort of shared attention practiced over generations is just part of the very fabric of island life, where landscape is not a backdrop to this activity. It shapes and defines it and loves it. I found myself saying out loud as I was watching the horses in full graze. And it's exploring this central place of love that will be the sort of last parts of this talk, because it's through love and placemaking that domestication relationships can be seen as more than a continuation of the past or an isolated activity happening today, but can actually be understood as a key part of creating home and maintaining a sense of belonging, and also working towards sustainable island futures. When I'd been writing the conclusion of my thesis, I mean, the thing was riddled with typos as it was, but one particular typo was where I'd been writing a lot about livable landscapes, and I kept accidentally writing lovable. And after a while, I realised that's just exactly what it is. They are lovable landscapes. The livable that I've been writing about was about sustainability. Now, if you're ever on social media during some of our stormier weather, you might see footage of Tesco shelves empty, you know, there's no bread, there's no milk, there's no fruit or veg. This usually happens after a couple of days where weather has stopped the boat to Scotland. And although we will all have things in the freezer and in the cupboards, you know, like a bit of drama, I'm guilty of it myself. I'll put some pictures on Instagram or Twitter, you know, look at Tesco, the shelves are bare. But this reality of how easy it is for the food in the supermarkets that are usually so predictable, it brings this idea of food security pretty much to the fore. You know, it's part of what we would be thinking about and experiencing. And although today a lot of people might have barns and have bigger breeds of cattle and sheep and buy extra feed and things for them, you know, people don't only have the native breeds. The economic feasibility of this could change quite quickly depending on the transport costs, the food costs, and how much you're selling those animals for. Maintaining the types of breeds that can live in Shetland and ensuring that they can continue to live in this environment in a way, and making sure they have their intelligence and hardiness, is seen as a way of preserving and promoting a way of life and a type of sustainability that could become increasingly important with climate change and issues of food security. So that is the livable. I'm going to get a little bit more to the lovable. And one of my absolute favourite quotes that's in thesis and book and everything is Anna Singh from the Mushroom at the End of the World. And she writes that over the past few decades, many kinds of scholars have shown that allowing only human protagonists in our stories is not just an ordinary human bias, it is a cultural agenda tied to dreams of progress through modernisation. There's other ways of making worlds. Anthropologists have become interested, for example, in how subsistence hunters recognise other living beings as persons, that is, protagonists of stories. Indeed, how could it be otherwise? Yet expectations of dreams of progress block this insight. Talking animals are for children and primitives. Their voice is silent. We imagine well-being without them. We trample over them for our advancement. We forget that collaborative survival requires cross-species coordination. To enlarge what is possible, we need other kinds of stories, including adventures in landscape. And coming back to this idea of stories as generative that I was speaking about at the beginning, you know, the types of stories we tell about things matter. And so when we're telling stories about domestication and how we live with animals, this is shaping possibilities. Historically, in a lot of Western philosophy, religion, and science, this idea of a separation between humans and nature has just been a central part of that. Plants and animals are often understood in quite mechanical ways, responding to stimuli and innate biology, rather than being sentient beings that can engage in meaningful relationships with us. And it is from this sort of context that the traditional ideas of domestication as control that I am writing against, they sort of emerge from. Violence and control don't have to be part of domestication relationships, and although it's something we see a lot of, I mean, looking at any sort of industrial farming, looking at the everyday cruelty on the human-animal relationships there, you know, what the animals are experiencing. Also, of course, the harm that this causes on a more global scale with, you know, with climate change and landscape degradation. But this isn't the only type of domestication relationship, and sometimes the narratives that imply domination and violence are essential to domestication can actually legitimize this sort of thing by giving the idea that that is just an inevitable part of domestication. That is what domestication is. And what I have been trying to show through this work is that even in a very Western domination type of relationship that we would see, this sort of pedigree breeding as the epitome of control, even within this breeding, you know, horse breeding in Britain, this doesn't have to be a relationship based on domination, and quite often it isn't. Obviously, there's elements of control, and this is something I go into more in other places. There's quite a balance between ideas of the horse's independence and the human control over what is happening. But that being there doesn't mean that the relationship is entirely based on domination, or indeed that domination is the founding principle of these domestication relationships. And to assume that it is says more about what we think about domestication, what our ideas about what human-animal relationships are possible within this context, rather than what's the relationships that are actually unfolding in practice. And when we can tell other stories about domestication, ones with love and connection at their centre, and this can be part of our journey, our shared journey with non-humans. And there the line in particular in Anna Singh's quote that stands out to me is, "We imagine well-being without them." We've told stories of human exceptionalism for so long that this idea of separation from landscape and animals has become quite unquestioned. It's just something that can be part of life, and other types of connection becoming forgotten. And that's really what the breeders in Shetland were worried about, was the idea of losing this connection between people, ponies, and landscape. But if we think of ourselves as emerging from the relationships that we have, you know, what makes us is what we do every day, the types of relationships we have. And if our identities are shaped by relationships with others, then what harm can it be doing when we are maintaining and enforcing these types of separations? But as I worked with Arctic Domist colleagues to rethink and reimagine domestication, I felt quite a renewed hope about what these relationships can be, because it was that learning that domination is not the founding principle of domesticate, or certainly not the founding principle of all domestication relationships. It was finding that the domus, the home, and a home shared with animals, comprised of myriad meaningful multi-species relationships. And this is where I started to think of domestication as an ongoing and changing relationship between people, ponies, and landscape in Shetland. And throughout the fieldwork, I heard stories about the joy that spending time with ponies could bring. And often people were describing particular times in their lives where horses helped them make it through difficult times. And I do write a little bit about animal therapy and how this sort of idea of animal assisted therapy as something that can be healing. But it is more than just these memorable encounters. It's the everyday experience with ponies and the joy that that brings that I think of as being quite a part of creating healthy landscapes and communities. Because when people are working on the crofts with any of the native breeds, they're doing so with attention to the generations that came before and those that will come after. And through this, there is cultivating a sense of home and belonging in the islands. So far from it, domestication as separating from the natural world, as it were, it is a way of extending home from the four walls of the house into the garden, into the land around, into the hill where the animals live. And to be living this way is to be part of a sentient and connected landscape, being open to the world and the possibility of more than human communication. And it's a home that is co-created through domestication relationships. And these connections stretch through time. They're keeping alive the stories of the island's past, connecting them to present day activities, and actively creating and maintaining a valued way of life into the future. So each day's activities, whether it's grooming, showing, or feeding your horses, it's not something that's happening in isolation. They are part of vast communities between generations, human and animal, past and present, and future. And to work this way and feel part of a place, feel part of a greater story, it actively contributes to a sense of peace and joy for many of the folk that are doing this. So when I made that typo, lovable, instead of livable, I realised it is exactly what this is. This is landscapes of love. It's love for Shetland, it's wild hill and rugged coast. It's love for the stories of independence and survival against the odds. And of course, it's love for the horses who made this survival possible and who continue to connect people to landscape and history today.